Well, thank you all for joining today. It is now 2 o'clock, so we will get this webinar started. So my name is Nancy Tudorosh, and I am the Regional Vice President for Gbta here in Canada. And I'm thrilled to have you join us today for the very first of our Gbta Canada Committee webinar series, Future Proofing Your Travel Risk Policy. So we have an exciting topic on hand today, but I wanted to give you some updates on a few things that we have coming up for Gbta in Canada. And as many of you know, we were really excited this year in 2021 to launch 5 new committees for Gbta here in Canada. We have the Accommodations Committee, the Risk Committee, Technology Committee, Transportation Committee, and the Meetings and Events Committee. And the fantastic things with these committees is they've got a lot of engagement and involvement opportunities for us going on throughout the calendar of 2021. With our Gbta Canada Committee webinar series, as I mentioned, we are starting today, March 11th, with our Risk Committee, and then we will progress on through the remaining months of the year, April, August, October, and December, with various Canadian-specific topics that are relevant to our marketplace and our country, delivered from our brand new Canadian committee. So I encourage you to be on the lookout as these dates come across, and make sure that you register to attend the various Canadian committees for Gbta. In addition to that, we do have a lot of activity that's also going on for Gbta Canada. So some other virtual events happening this year. We have for our buyer onlys, our regional direct talk calls, where we are right now in the process of, we just had our first call the other day talking about our Canadian Travel Buyer Toolkit. So that is something we'll be continuing to engage with between March and April. And then we will continue on with our buyer only direct talks for the remaining half of the year. Further to that, we have our town hall calls. Our next call will be on April the 7th, and I definitely encourage you to join us. And I'll be sharing more updates on Gbta Canada, our events, and everything that we have going on to help deliver tools, resources, education, and information to our Canadian business travel community. For more information on our Gbta Canada events and webinars, please visit us at gbta.org/Canada. Now, with that, let's dive right into the content for today. It is my pleasure to introduce Kate King, who is with International SOS, and also the chair of our Gbta Canada Risk Committee that'll be moderating today's session. So over to you, Kate.
Hi, Nancy. Thank you very much for that. I am so happy to be here today, not just introducing the session, but introducing you to the first ever Gbta Canada Risk Committee. The formation of Canadian-specific committees has long been in the works for Gbta, and I can't think of a better time to stand this up than right now, when our community has to come together like never before and work in concert for a safe return to travel. From a risk perspective, the headlines, the intelligence, the advice, and the recommendations that everyone is seeking, they're very country-specific, even provincially specific. So a large part of our role is going to be bringing you the information that you need as Canadians. So thanks go to Nancy and her team for gathering such an outstanding group of professionals to build our committee. My co-chair, Suzanne Sangiovese, and our committee members, Jim Kiakia, Laura Franceschini, Chris Lewis, Josh Schildroth, Michelle St. Cyr, and Jennifer Taylor. So over the next year, you can expect the Canada Risk Committee to champion return to travel initiatives that balance industry growth with employee health and safety, to share resources to support planning for a safe return to travel, to advocate for the inclusion of health and wellness, including mental health in all risk management frameworks, to provide resources and thought leadership to support you in fulfilling duty of care obligations, and of course, to provide the Gbta Canada community with a Canadian perspective on global risk topics and ensure that Canadian voices are included in global initiatives. In addition to our key objectives, we are committed to working in a collaborative and globally inclusive manner, which for us means to consider not just a Canadian perspective, but a global perspective. We know that many of you are responsible for global programs and for employees beyond Canadian borders. So Suzanne and I are liaising regularly with the Global Risk Committee, the Europe Committee, and Gbta LATAM, and you can expect to occasionally see content and speakers from other regions where we feel it'll benefit the Canadian buyer community. Oh, and now the main reason why we're here: travel risk and organizational resilience. It is really hard to believe that it's been 1 year today since the World Health Organization declared the new coronavirus to be a global pandemic. And it's remarkable, really, to consider how much we've learned in such a short time, or what we didn't know that we didn't know. So the challenges of the past year have led many organizations to re-examine their approach to travel and to risk management, and to ask what they can do to be more prepared for the next major disruption. Our panel today will discuss the value of a travel risk policy during COVID and beyond. So I'm pleased to introduce Brooke Davis, Global Travel and Events Manager at Lululemon, Paul Doucette, Security Director for Canada at International SOS, and Suzanne Sangiovese, Commercial and Communications Director at Riskline. So my first question is for Brooke. Brooke, Lululemon has had a travel risk management program in place for several years. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came about and why you decided to put it in place?
Sure, Kate, and thanks everyone. It's a pleasure to connect with you virtually today, and I'm very excited about this being the inaugural Risk Committee event and look forward to future events. Yeah, I mean, Lululemon's been on a journey with our travel risk policy. I started 5 years ago. And at that time, our travel footprint was growing exponentially, like 20% year over year. And we were going into new markets that represented new risks and unknown threats to our travelers. But while we built a business case and we're really eager to partner with a duty of care provider, we didn't really get the executive championship that we needed to advance the program until our executives actually faced their own risk event. They were at an offsite in Tofino, and there was a tsunami scare. And so in the middle of the night, they were ushered into an elementary school and were, facing the reality that they might have to be evacuated. And what we realized at that time was nobody knew where they were, and nobody knew how to access them or track them or to provide the support that they needed. And I think that really was a moment where our executives realized that there's vulnerabilities that happen for our travelers all over the world, and that we really need to resource our travel program to be able to support travelers when they are in risk positions. And so with that, never let a good disaster go to waste, or somewhat of a disaster. But, everybody was fine and there was no real major outcomes from that. But they all saw that the importance of partnering with a third-party duty of care provider. And so we went forward with that case and were able to get funding, and momentum built from there. And as I look back, we've had to deal with some major challenges globally. We were dealing with the protests in Hong Kong, the bombings in Sri Lanka, fires in Malibu when we were about to have an ambassador event. So, I think that the travel risk policy goes way beyond COVID and this moment, and looking at the numerous geopolitical and terrorists and natural threats that face any traveler going forward. So while this is a great moment that we're in to highlight to your executive that we need to have a risk program in place, and this is just one of many concerns going forward. So that's sort of been our journey.
Yeah, I know, that's interesting. I love that. I've heard of it before, but I love that story. It's such a good one. And it's funny how many people I ask that question to, how many more stories like that you hear. But I mean, you make a really good point that I was going to ask you, but it's definitely not just a COVID thing at all. But Suzanne, what do you think about that? Because I'd like to hear from you and Paul both, if you think that it's worth implementing something like this now, like a travel risk management policy, when, some people are saying that the worst of the pandemic could potentially be over in less than a year.
Right. I really like this hopeful idea that it's over and, everything, the worst of it is behind us. And I hate to be the person that's going to take this down a very dark tunnel right now, this conversation. But we have seen, many countries around the world, including Canada, has done a tremendous effort, in combating the crisis that we're in, just in terms of things like improving testing operations, rolling out this mass vaccine campaign that we've got going on. But from a global perspective, it's a completely different story. Not everyone, not all countries are experiencing this the same that we may be, or other kind of developed and privileged nations are. For example, we have nations that are reliant on the COVAX, which is a global vaccination effort that's being led by the WHO. And they're currently not going to achieve full immunization until at least 2024, which is quite a few years off. And I mean, this may sound to us in Canada that, well, that's fine, we're not being reliant on COVAX, but this unequal distribution, really what's going to happen is going to start to also affect these developing countries, and developed countries, because the longer that you have large parts of the globe that aren't vaccinated, there's the higher chance we're going to see more mutations. And we're already seeing that kind of now with the British variant, South African, Brazilian, but there's also the higher risk too. We kind of could end up with this sort of Wuhan, January 2020 popping up in a place like sub-Saharan Africa, where people that are infected by a mutation that doesn't respond to the vaccination. So people get reinfected again. Which I know this sounds horrible, but it is a reality that we kind of, have to think that it's a possibility. Even mitigation measures like the masks, quarantines, we can kind of expect this to continue, I think, into next year, especially the mask use, on public transportation specifically. And a lot really remains to be seen with exemptions. You don't need to have a quarantine if you have the vaccine. How long does immunity last with a vaccine? Are we getting booster shots every year or 2 years? Again, so many questions and not many answers kind of out there. And finally, as well, I mean, it's just not COVID with a policy. This is risk exists. Risk exists before COVID, even low levels. So now's not the time to sort of throw any sort of travel risk policy out the window just because we think the worst is behind us.
Yeah, no, and I mean, you raise a lot of good points. And if I can try to put a positive spin on any of that, one thing that I would say is that, knowing now that this is not a 1-year event, and to your point, there's going to be global repercussions and concerns for a long time, I think as Canadians and as North Americans, we are now at a point where we realize that we need to sort of live through this. We're not waiting for it to be over before we get on with our lives. And that's the positive turning point right now. And so that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. A lot of us are looking at getting back to travel, albeit with risks, but life goes on. And so what can we do to be able to travel and be safe and live our lives during this? So Paul, from your perspective, anything to add on this in terms of whether it's the right time to implement the travel risk policy, where you see this going, how you think it looks different with or without COVID?
Yeah, thanks. And Suzanne, we won't shoot the messenger, but that was quite depressing what you just had to say. No doubt it's the truth.
So sorry.
Forgiven, but it is the truth. I mean, like you mentioned, like some of the developing countries of the world, they're going to be in this for a long time with the variants and so on. It's here to stay. I think maybe I'll just shift gears a little bit on this, and I'll say, like, if you're just developing a travel policy now, a travel risk management policy at this point, it's far too late. This is not something that just came out of nowhere and suddenly is a need. This is something that's been a need for a long, long time. It's been an expectation for staff for a long, long time, that there is a policy to take care of you when you are traveling on behalf of your organization as an agent of your organization going overseas, doing business or whatever it may be. That expectation has always been there. And if you didn't have a way to meet the expectation, you were going to be in trouble, and liability risks were very real and remain so today. I think the pandemic really brought into focus the fact that travel within low-risk destinations is still risky. Travel these kind of threats don't see borders, especially medical ones. So the risk now in terms of creating a policy, I think, is actually quite, in a sense, almost the wrong time, not only because it's late, but because people at the moment are going to be a little bit blinded by COVID as the only risk that there is. So it's important, if you do undertake this at this point, to not focus on, well, we need a policy because of the pandemic. No. You need a policy because of all the spectrum of risks that are out there. And the pandemic is significant enough that you should probably have a special section, right, within your policy. But for it to be focused only on that would be a mistake. I think it's one of the big picture sort of risk management trends and issues that's happening right now is that blind spot that the pandemic will have created in many aspects, not just policy creation, but in all kinds of other practices of doing business and managing risks. It's not just the only thing that's happening out there. All the other types of risks that have traditionally existed still exist and will continue to do so. So that's an important point I wanted to bring up. And maybe just to digress slightly on that, I think the structure, because this is something that I do a lot of, that we as International SOS do a lot of, is just is the consultation around creation of a policy and creation of what a best practice duty of policy looks like. So the way we approach it is, what is the organization doing from an overall sort of commitment to duty of care standpoint? And then what are all the actions, both for a given traveler and from the organization's perspective, before you travel, during travel, and after travel? And if you look at it from those sort of four perspectives and think about each in turn, that should be the starting point to creating a well-structured policy that covers all the bases.
Yeah, agreed. And I think for better or for worse in terms of timing, I think now with a lot of clients that I speak to looking at maybe a September return to travel, I think a lot of people are undertaking this work now and sort of trying to plan this out, what it will look like. So going through, I like the way that you break it down: before travel, during travel, after travel. Suzanne, maybe start with you again. In terms of specifically before travel, what's really important that travelers need to be aware of pre-travel?
Right. Well, Paul's kind of said this. I mean, if you're thinking about just implementing a policy now, it's a little too late. But if you missed the pandemic the first time around, you still have time to get the pandemic, epidemics into your policy for the next foreseeable one. Because again, I guess I am the Debbie Downer here today of the discussion. There will be
Please don't
more
say the next
pandemics.
Please don't say it.
I know we're not even out of this one.
Yeah, but even beyond pandemics, I mean, just looking at sort of your travel risk policy in general. Under maybe you have a section about pandemics, but all of the day-to-day risks as you travel, the border closures. I mean, we still think about malaria, you think about robbery, you think about hotel safety and security. So as far as like pre-travel preparation,
exactly. Yeah. And a lot of that does come down to that information. It's having that access to reliable, your trusted, the sources, the correct, I hate to say kind of the correct sources, but it's really that reliable information when it comes to getting travel back on the road. So the legislation, the exit and entry requirements, what are the rules around testing and vaccines, and keep a constant eye on this. It's not just 7 days out, 14 days out, and that's it. You kind of close down that tab out of your window. We're really in this fast changing regulatory environment. Things are constantly, even during the trip process, stuff may be changing. So it's really important that you're constantly monitoring this information pre-trip. And as Paul said too, it's not just COVID. We've had these traditional risks have been around pre-COVID. They'll be there after COVID as well. And often when we think about destination risk, it's sometimes associated with countries that have, we assume that they're more inherently risky because of the security situation on the ground, if this is insurgency, border conflicts, a kidnap and ransom threat. But there's also things, very kind of almost the routine risks, sort of severe weather systems. We live in Canada. We know all about that. Illnesses, just common ailments that a traveler could have that could affect them. Traffic accidents, petty theft, having your laptop sort of stolen or company phone stolen while you're traveling if you're in an area that could have higher crime rates. So it's this kind of information that's really, really important to be accessible pre-trip. And it's not just the destination, it's also the traveler risk profile as well. So to understand too that every traveler is going to have, their unique risks, whether it's female travelers, LGBTQ, Indigenous, Black, people of color, road warriors versus the first person, the first time that they're on the road, travelers with disabilities as well. So there's a lot to kind of take into consideration when it comes to that pre-trip information to build into your policy.
Yeah, making sure the information's available, making sure that the right training's available. Brooke, what's important to Lululemon for people before they travel?
Well, we really are focused on well-being and confidence and ensuring that travelers feel as if they have choice about their travel experience. And we really want to equip everyone with the most up-to-date information. And we've been leaning heavily on our suppliers to let us know what COVID protocols that they've put in place. And we've just really focused. It's definitely become more of a bespoke kind of program versus self-service like it was historically. So now we are involved in every single trip that occurs across the planet, and really looking at it from that business critical lens as well as that permissible travel lens. And, and I have regular conversations with travelers and trying to equip them for what the travel experience is foreseeably going to look like for them, just to, give them the opportunity to surface any concerns they have and hopefully provide reassurance. And, we've instituted this new pre-trip authorization process, which just provides that level of visibility and support. So it's really a lot more hand-holding at the beginning of a trip than we ever did in the past. And I think that will continue on as we navigate the vaccine distribution and the new health passport requirements, et cetera, et cetera. But really, it is getting into those conversations with travelers, as everyone does have a unique perspective, and reminding them of the resources that are available to them when they are on the road. Yeah, absolutely. And Paul, I know you work with a lot of different types of clients, the travel risk management. So is there anything else, specifically I know there are different industries have been traveling kind of straight through the pandemic, essential industries, mining, oil and gas, that sort of thing. Anything that would look different for someone trying to put together a trip approval process for that type of work?
Yeah, I think you've just touched on something really important there. So fully aligned as well. I love the answers there from Suzanne and Brooke. And I think this is a good point just to build a little bit further as well, as industry matters, right? What you do as an organization matters. What you do, what your missions is, what your goals and objectives are as an organization makes a huge difference. It determines what your risk appetite will be in part. And it determines, what kind of trips you're willing to go ahead and do, and also what's required for those trips. So as you mentioned, a lot of heavy industrial clients may have never stopped traveling, essentially, may still continue to go because their work's essential. If your objectives as an organization, say as a privately held mining company, are to make money for your shareholders, but also to be compliant and to make sure you stay compliant with OSHA and other regulations. So with that in mind, visiting sites and ensuring safety protocols are remaining up to standard, ensuring equipment is not faulty. These things are not optional, right? If you're going to continue to do your business, this is not an optional thing that you can just choose to do or not do. So if you want to use a local contractor, that's okay, but you need to make sure that local contractor has the same standards as you have, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, you can find yourself in some hot soup. So it's important to understand that different perspective, right? So as a consultant, where I work with a lot of different sectors, a lot of different organizations all the time, the first thing that I always try to do is understand that risk appetite question. How much risk, and it's different than risk tolerance, right? Some organizations approach it as we'll tolerate a certain level of risk, but nothing beyond that. And that's common in the universities that we work with. In other sectors, it's more about appetite. And some organizations will have a specific statement that we want to take this much risk because this is, our business model. And it's an important way to look at it, and defining that dynamic is critical to understanding, how a risk approval process will be done as per policy. What will be expected as duty of loyalty from the people who are traveling under your policy? What is the company going to do as part of its duty of care? All of that is determined by all the factors Suzanne mentioned, by everything what Brooke said around wellness as well, but then also by the appetite of the organization and people's employment contracts and that sort of thing as well. So, visiting a mine site to inspect the safety measures on site is more essential than a university trying to ensure students have a good experience in their third semester or something like that with a study abroad program. It's a very different dynamic.
Yeah, no, it's true. And Brooke's point, it's very bespoke right now. Everything is very customized. Just thinking about mine sites and all of the sort of assignees and rotational workers that are there, planning for that kind of travel, you have to look at each individual. They may be from different nationalities, and their travel patterns are going to be influenced by that because of what countries they can travel through. Different employees are going to have to rotate through different countries, have different itineraries back home. Some may have to quarantine for 2 weeks in a third country on their way back home. So a lot of planning. Yeah, absolutely. So then, okay, you get the trip approved, people travel, they're prepared, they're trained up. What about during travel, Suzanne, when people are away on the road? What's most important, some of the most important things?
Right. Well, we'll keep that information and that good, trusted, reliable information flowing. Just, don't forget about it. Continue that process during the trip. Also give that information to the traveler so they're also aware of what's going on around them. But also it's about locating and communicating with your traveler. And I use the word locate instead of tracking, because I know sometimes there's a negative connotation with the word tracking and Big Brother is watching and everything, but it's just know where your travelers are. And I think probably Brooke knows this better than anyone. A lot of times they aren't where they say they are, or they aren't where their itinerary. And of course, this isn't travelers going rogue, but flights get diverted, canceled, delayed, mix-ups happen with hotel bookings. So it's understanding just to know where your traveler is, also being able to communicate them, and make sure too your traveler knows that mode of communication. How is that flow going to happen? Is it via email? Is it via an in-app messaging service? Is it by telephone? And make sure they also on the other end too know how to get back and communicate with the office. You can do things like a daily check-in process. It's just anything to keep that dialogue going during in-trip.
Mm-hmm. Brooke, is there anything specific that Lululemon is asking travelers to do differently while on the road?
Well, I think, personal responsibility is one of our core values. And so, we are asking that sort of duty of loyalty from our travel community, that they maintain good hygiene and respect the COVID protocols that are in place so that they can keep themselves safe and those that they interact with. And that has just become at the forefront. That's your responsibility. And, we are trusting our people to do the right thing and show up as good humans in the world. And, as much as we are there to support, we recognize that they have, responsibility too, to contribute to that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a huge point. And duty of loyalty, it's such a good point. We've talked about it a lot in the past. And I think as sort of more of theoretically, and I think now it's really coming to light more as it's becoming something that's more sort of codified within an actual travel risk policy. Like, you have an obligation to wash your hands. It's not optional. It's very interesting. It's a lot of changes and a lot of reconditioning that kind of mindset of what personal responsibility means. I mean, on the other hand, people are used to it. I've heard a lot of discussions about, supplying employees with PPE and masks when they travel. But the reality is, as humans, we've all been doing this for a year now. So hopefully those habits are ingrained. This isn't anything new. When people set out on the road, you behave as you would when you're at home. Yeah. Okay. So then I guess after travel, because Suzanne, you made a really good point. We were talking about this last week. We usually, in the past, when you look at these travel risk policies, the returning home from travel part is kind of minimized. It's sort of the least exciting part. Whereas now, I mean, it's huge. First of all, let's make sure that you get home. That's in and of itself is more of a question. And then what needs to be undertaken once you get back home from travel, what's still really important. So, Suzanne, how do you think that policy needs to address the after travel or the returning home part?
Right, for sure. I mean, not most, I should say, most business trips aren't one way, right? There is a return home factor, and it's the duty of care obligation really to get that traveler back home safely, not just make it to the destination, to the meeting, and that's it, your job is done. Kind of in COVID times, we understand too that now there's these new testing rules, especially for Canada. There's the hotel quarantine factor. You may think, well, they landed back at the airport. Now my job is done, but still no, there's still more steps to get them back home. And it's just being aware of that. What is really in store as they start to make that return trip home. And generally speaking too, just in terms of kind of like crisis management, it's good to have something in place. To know what to do when a crisis situation happens, to ensure that they're getting home safely. It doesn't have to be a high payload incident, just even again, something that's very routine as a traffic accident. In that situation, of course, the traveler is definitely going to think that is the ultimate crisis that they're currently experiencing. So again, it's having that plan in place. I also like this idea too of just having a kind of a check-in with if it's HR or the person that's managing travel and that traveler to see how the trip went. This doesn't have to be a formal questionnaire or anything, but to get their insight to ensure that that trip did go safely. Did everything go as planned? Did they run into any problems? Because of course, nothing's going to change if nothing changes. So to get that feedback in order just to make the experience better for the next traveler as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I love that. Paul, from your perspective, what do you see other organizations including in their policies specifically regarding after travel?
Sure. I think the first thing is what Suzanne just mentioned, which is that survey to allow people to just feed back into the system to say, like, if this is the policy that's governing the way that we manage travel, then everyone should have an opportunity to have a say in that, because they're the ones that actually is for, right? And they're the ones who actually are covered under it or using it. So I think that's an excellent point. Obviously, with infectious diseases being a reality of the world today, all of them, not just the main one that we all have on our minds every day, but all of them, understanding those different threat vectors and how that can have an important impact on someone returning from a destination. And that includes things that aren't infectious too. I mean, take, for example, malaria, which has long been something that I've heard our doctors talk about on and on and on, because it's such an important type of a threat vector, so easy to catch. You can have it for 6 months before you realize what it is. So protocols around the way that that's handled whenever anyone does go to a malarial zone is, when you come back, no matter what you've done in terms of prophylaxis, if you get sick, it is malaria until proven otherwise for 6 months. And that's the protocol. So things like this are really important. I think, other things that can go forgotten would be to include something around cyber risk and the way that our devices can be exposed to things. It's more easy to target a traveler when they're outside their home environment using public Wi-Fi networks and the like, whether that's at cafes or hotels or whatever it may be. So there is that added risk, and especially, and it varies country to country. There's a lot of countries in the world that we may not think of as high cyber risk. There's obvious ones we don't need to mention by name, but there's others. For example, Germany is actually considered quite a high cyber risk destination. Not everyone knows that. But anyway, it is important to have good visibility on where risks are elevated, and then to make sure that when we come back to our office environment, that we're not infecting the entire company through our devices, and that there are protocols in place for how to manage that. Additionally, some people may experience traumas. They may experience, before COVID, there was a lot of people that were experiencing who were just over traveled, and the mental health aspects of travel come into it. There was an amazing study done by, I believe it was MIT or one of the really big Ivy League schools in the United States, that looked at the impact business travel has on emotional well-being and mental health. And that showed that, I think it was something around 7 or 8 days of travel per month, people's mental health actually improved a little bit. And then there was a turning point after which your mental health decreased dramatically. So if it was, I think, above 9 or 10 days per month, at that point, it started to get really bad. And if you're up to like 15 or 16 days of travel per month, it was dire. And almost everyone had some sort of mental health problem. So that part of it, providing emotional support, being sensitive to this, aware of this, I think is extremely important part of the after travel piece for policy as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's such a good point. And I'm glad you brought it up. I wanted to talk about mental health. I didn't know that number. I mean, that explains so much, because you hear about the negative effects of travel on the mental health, and you hear about the positive effects too, but that little timeline actually makes a lot of sense. And so, I mean, so that's something that is sort of been known recently over the past couple of years, the effect of business travel. But now, I mean, it's incidence of mental health issues has, like, I don't want to say skyrocketed, but the CDC, the last report that I read in the fall, they had tracked 41% incidence of mental health issues, which was about a 3 times increase from their study the year before. And it's clear why it's happening. Anxiety and depression are the physical manifestations of stress in many cases, and everyone living through this pandemic is under a lot of stress for different reasons. There's employees who are really, really concerned about their job security, or they've lost their jobs and it's financial concerns. For those who are still working, there are increased workloads. We talked about rotational workers again, but that's huge. The isolation, there are employees who left home thinking they were going on a 4-week work assignment and were gone for months and months and months, including many isolated periods. And I mean, there's the fear of catching the virus and infecting your family with it when you come back home from work. And all of those things combined have led to really what some people are saying could be the next public health crisis is mental health. And so, I mean, do you all think, I'm curious to hear from everyone on this, if you think that it should be addressed in travel risk policy? Do you think that an organization is exposing it themselves to additional risk if they don't account for it in the policy, now that it is such a known issue, a sort of foreseeable issue of travel? don't know what I kind of want to hear from everyone. Paul, do you have anything on that else to add about
that? Yeah, I mean, I personally do think that it should be in the policy, because a policy that governs travel risk management should be seen as the organization's standard for what our duty of care is when we're asking people to travel for their jobs, right? Simple as that. So with that as the basic framework of it, it is known now, right? It's a known, right? Yeah. It's not an unknown. It's not an unknown. It's a known in the vernacular of like Dwight Eisenhower. So it's one of those things where if you don't do it, it can legitimately now be questioned as to, look, the law says what is reasonably foreseeable. That's the sort of language that's used in the criminal code around liability for the duty of care and organization.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
So that's the language used. What is a reasonably foreseeable risk? And at this stage, there's a very strong argument, and a growing every day in strength argument that mental health is a reasonably foreseeable risk that should be addressed. So if you put it in the policy, of course, then you're also held to it. And it's important that, you don't simply have it on paper, but that the right actions are also taken, and that it's sort of becomes built into the corporate culture. You address it openly, address it in open forums. You have information sessions that look at it. It is a reasonable part of duty of care in that sense. So it's important to be proactive about it. Yes, have it in policy, and yes, take the appropriate actions. If you aren't sure as an organization what those actions should be and what exactly you should be doing, seek out professional guidance on that. And there's a lot of organizations out there that can provide that.
Yeah, no, that's all very good advice. Brooke, is there anything, has Lululemon changed travel policies or any of their policies around mental health over the past year?
Well, to echo Paul's point around corporate culture, what's been really amazing over the past year is that there has been an openness and encouragement to discuss and dialogue mental health issues. And we had our leadership summit a couple of weeks ago, and it was an amazing display of leadership and vulnerability that some of our senior leaders expressed some of the mental health challenges that they've been going through over the past year. And I think hearing that top down, this impacts everybody across the spectrum, and that understanding that it does influence how you show up at work and how you travel. So there's really been a destigmatizing of mental health issues within our organization. And so it's not as far-fetched to bring up that conversation in contemplating a trip and saying, do you feel supported? And here are the resources available to you. But just an acknowledgement that mental health can be as damaging as a physical accident can be. And knowing that our travelers are going to be encountering new scenarios and new risks on the road. I think about our road warriors who, have been traveling for years, but they're going to encounter a new travel experience soon when we, international borders open up, and they're going over to Asia to visit our factory partners. They're going to be encountering a lot of new challenges that will impact their sense of security and well-being. So to be able to comfortably have a dialogue with their leadership team about what impacts travel has on their mental health, I think is really encouraging. And it speaks to this entire movement of being a whole person at work. I think we're all experiencing that it's work-life integration now, especially as we're all working from home. And so it's not parsing out and compartmentalizing different areas of your life. They're all very integrated and impacted. And I think it's just getting to that point of being really comfortable to share and acknowledge. That's really important. And so Lululemon has dramatically increased our mental health coverage within our benefits, and have offered a number of resources internally for people to access that support 24/7. So I'm really encouraged to see that, and hope that we will expand upon that in the same way that we're acknowledging diversity and inclusion and the importance of having a partner ecosystem that acknowledges the values that we express in the D&I space. So it's, COVID has brought to light some really challenging things for our organization, but really some exciting opportunities that will really help our people and our culture going forward.
Yeah, oh, that's great to hear. That's huge. And I think you're right. The first step is talking about it, making it comfortable, normalizing it. And then, and once that's there, if there is that level of comfort and it's something that you can talk about, it's much easier to start to ask more questions and uncover that there's actually a lot of resources, and mental planning for mental health incidents or issues when you're traveling should be and can be as routine as planning for other types of health incidents while you're planning. Not everyone realizes you can research the supports in your destination before you go. If you know that you struggle with depression or anxiety and you speak to a counselor or psychiatrist on a regular basis at home, you can investigate and get a referral to, especially if you're going to be away for a long period of time, you can investigate and get a referral to a psychiatrist in your destination. If you take prescription psychiatric drugs, it's very worthwhile to investigate, are those drugs available in your location if you run out, or these days, if your trip gets extended and you're not able to return home and you need to refill. I think once it becomes sort of on the same page, on the table with the other medical risks, I think it really opens up how much more planning and preparation can be done that actually is kind of being not necessarily done right now. Yeah. Okay. Brooke, you touched on this a little bit, but in terms of vendors, the airlines and the hotels and the ground transportation, how does that fit in? Do those fit into your travel risk policy? Is that part of it?
For sure. And, we have definitely strengthened relationships with our suppliers over the past year. And, I've been really impressed with the agility that our preferred suppliers have evidenced with getting COVID protocols stood up within a short period of time. And, it's being in constant conversation with our suppliers and hearing about the exciting new initiatives and ways they're trying to keep people safe, and that we can communicate that outwards to our travel community. It's been vital, I think, to our learning and growth of our travel program. And what's interesting, and I think from a buyer perspective, this having a travel risk policy that mandates booking within your TMC and mandates booking with your preferred suppliers actually accomplishes a lot of organizational objectives beyond the risk policy, and helps you to achieve those, savings and, production requirements, maybe not in the 2020 perspective, but going forward. And it just really harnessing those preferred suppliers and, talking to your travelers about what they're doing. And it just, helps us to kind of consolidate the program, reach our targets, and just, strengthen those partnerships going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great point. Now there's a real motivation for employees to kind of do the right thing and stick within the recommended suppliers more than before.
And I think travelers get it if they know that they are booking within the system, and that's the only way we can locate and support you if something does go awry. So you're trying to be a big brother or just trying to get you to choose that hotel. It's really, if you're booking within the system, then we have the infrastructure to support you.
Yeah, no, there couldn't be a better business case for it right now than that.
I can just add on one thing, Kate, on that one. Just came to mind as I was listening to Brooke make those excellent points, is that another perspective on this is simply from a duty of care standpoint, identifying those suppliers, vetting them to make sure that they're the right ones for you is part of your core emergency response plan, which should be part of your policy. And having your travelers understand what that emergency response plan is, what they would do if they get sick, is absolutely core to the during travel piece of your policy, right? So having that in an emergency, who do you call first? Okay, is it a medical emergency, or is there some security event taking place in my area, or have I experienced a physical security threat, right? Or something else. And whatever it is, having the right kind of third-party providers ready, vetted, and known to you in advance is extremely important. The last thing that you want to do is say, I had an employee call me, they've got a severe migraine and they're about to pass out. Let's Google some hospitals in that city that they're in. That's not the position anybody wants to be in, and that's not executing duty of care. So I just want to make that point as well, is looking at it from that angle. The duty of care angle is also really important when it comes to those external suppliers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Thank you. So, from the three of you, a lot of good, I think, advice for everybody on putting together a travel risk policy. Question though, for smaller organizations like 10 to 50 people, do we think it's realistic or necessary to put a policy in place like this? And if so, is it going to look different? And is it something as a small organization, you don't necessarily partner with a large risk management provider? Are there resources available to try and do something like this yourself? Suzanne?
Oh, there are. You might have to do a little bit of research and searching online, but of course there is. Not all companies are going to be jetting off to dozens of countries around the world. For the companies that are just doing kind of domestic travel or just regional travel, maybe here in Canada, south of the border, a couple of states you're traveling to, you may not need that sort of really robust kind of policy, but you do need something. So there are definitely resources available just for like the information perspective, still with COVID, but like travel.gc.ca, as well as other information that they have too outside of COVID with advisories that could be in place in different countries. We have sites like the Canadian Federation for Independent Businesses, has a lot of tools and resources. There are a lot of different HR websites out there too that have templates available to kind of create your own policy, and even international non-government organizations kind of come up with their own toolkits and workbooks on how to sort of create yourself your own security risk assessment and do that and then create a plan from it as well.
Okay, good. And just so everyone knows, we will be, when Gbta shares the slides from this deck, we will be sharing out some resources for some of the sites that Suzanne just mentioned as well. So we are at 2:46 and we have a bunch of different questions coming in from the audience. So I think that will conclude the panel portion of today. Thank you all. And I'm going to jump into some of the questions if that's okay. So how are travel risk policies being rewritten or augmented from pre-COVID? For example, who will be approved to travel? How will the process change? Are there extra steps on the online booking tools? Oh, that's a good question. I don't know, Brooke, do you want to take this one?
Sure, and I think the biggest shift for us is instituting this new pre-trip approval process, which is a two-layered approval, VP plus, first level, and that's to give perspective from a business critical lens. And then the secondary approval is to myself, and that's to examine the destination and what may be the testing or quarantine requirements upon arrival or return. So I think that that's been the biggest shift for us.
Yeah. Companies often shy away from adding mental health to travel and risk policy due to liability issues. What's your take on that concern? So, and Paul, you kind of addressed that already, I think, but anything else to add on that?
Yeah, I think we talked about it a little bit. I mean, I think the liability concern is one around, I mean, are we going to hold ourselves to something that we weren't otherwise held to, essentially? Mm-hmm. So, right, by putting it as policy, are we then handcuffing ourselves to something that we don't know how to really manage, and then we're going to end up liable? I think it's just too important at this point. I think the world around mental health and the concern thereof, I mean, we see it in the Bell Canada campaigns, Let's Talk, right? It's so out in the open now. You can't, so there should be no thinking of like, putting it as policy is going to change anything. It just means that you've done something, you've taken the first step at least if you're putting it as policy, right? So I don't think it's the thing that will actually create the liability risk. I think the liability risk is there anyway because of the legislation and the culture. I think it's just there. But so if we put it as policy, that's a step in the right direction. And then if we action the preventative things and the response things that we need to do as per a good policy, then we'd be going a long way towards reducing liability, not enhancing it.
Mm-hmm. No, that's good. I agree. Should a travel risk policy be a function of HR?
Oh, I think that's an interesting question. It depends on the makeup of the organization. I can say that I have, in the past year, I've worked more closely with our risk team and HR, which we call people and culture, than any other department internally. And those relationships are integral, and it needs to be many voices at the table to have the conversation and get support. But HR, especially as we're moving forward, as we navigate the passports or whatever the requirements are for travel, there's going to be a lot of challenging conversations around who's eligible to travel, and data security and data privacy and health privacy. So HR is going to have to be at the table to support travel and risk in those conversations.
I would second that. I would say HR plays a critical role in it because it's about people's well-being and safety. But with the larger organizations that we work with, we find that it more typically sits with security, if security exists. And in larger organizations, it usually does. There usually is a full department dedicated to it, and that is often where it sits. But HR is always at the table, like Brooke said, right? They have to be, because it's about the people, and it's about sort of, in many cases, what's provided as part of duty of care policy is considered also a benefit. So it goes under benefits in many cases. But then also departments like HSE might be involved, and risk itself. And often BCP or emergency management for a lot of the more industrial companies is also a function in and of itself that plays a critical role in a good policy too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then of course at the universities, you have the study abroad program and versus the faculty travel, and every faculty has its own policy in some cases, and they're all siloed. So those things often factor in as well.
Yeah, and I think it definitely, there's multiple different teams and business units that you usually see involved, and it's successful, but important to consider the executive level as well. I think that's key to getting it off the ground and making the policy work. Is you can have HR, you can have security, but you need to have your CEO, you need to have your managing director, your COO, someone like that as well needs to be invested in the policy in order to really, as you said, Brooke, like lead by example. Next question, and this is interesting. I hadn't thought about this, but I think it's a good question. In the midst of the COVID environment and over the next 1 to 3 years, should companies have a contact tracing protocol for both employees and travelers? I mean, it's going to, and I think it's going to depend a lot on where your company's located and where you're operating, because there's a lot of overlap probably with, in Canada, there's overlap with provincial bodies in some cases, but not all. Brooke, I mean, does Lululemon do any contact tracing, or do you leave it to the provincial governments?
We have done that at the store level. Just in terms of store teams that may have been impacted. And then of course, within our essential staff that are going into our store support centers, our offices, we've implemented protocols around that, and obviously want to keep those team members safe. So if there are any exposure notices, they are given that information as quickly as they can deliver it. So, we haven't really seen that within the travel perspective yet, but I imagine that will be a conversation that we do have.
Yeah, when people start traveling more, it might come up more. How is each company handling the vaccination process? The question is, are you considering making vaccination a prerequisite to coming back to the office or to travel? And is it even legal to require proof of vaccination before being allowed back to work? These are the questions of the day. There's more questions than answers on this point, but we have a couple of minutes. Suzanne, just curious, for Riskline, does Riskline have a policy about vaccinations, or have you heard what the policy is going to be?
Well, we are actually a remote first company. So for us, it's kind of, we're, I guess, getting away from that a little bit, that we don't have to worry really about returning to the office, so to speak. I'm in my office right now, so it's wonderful, day in, day out, before COVID and after COVID. But I think it is something to consider just in terms of duty of care. I mean, I know that even with, you're traveling, people are coming back to the office just as part of this return policy, getting people back safely. I think it's really important to implement.
Any other thoughts on that? I mean, it's really, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Kate. We've come out and said that we will not require staff to be vaccinated. So that is our current posture. And while we are encouraging folks to get vaccinated as soon as they can, it's not going to be a requirement now around working in our store support centers or working in our stores or traveling.
Yeah, I think, that's what I've been hearing majority of organizations in North America saying. I mean, and it varies very much globally. In Asia, there are already in a lot of countries, a lot of organizations that are implementing a requirement to be vaccinated. In the US and in Europe, it's highly unlikely that that's ever going to be in place. I mean, from a North American perspective, in a lot of ways, I think it's around managing the accommodations. So, and, you know, I don't know specifically it's going to change based on your government, but obviously there are going to be individuals who don't get the vaccine for disability reasons, which is something that's going to need to be accommodated. And it's going to depend on jobs descriptions as well and industry. There's already, it's blurring the lines a lot right now, these conversations, because some companies have never really had to deal with these questions before. But if you look at organizations that are sending people into high-risk countries doing physically demanding jobs, they have long done employee health checkups, fit to fly examinations, and all of that stuff. Yellow fever vaccination is something that we are very used to talking about and asking about. So this is where the human resources comes into play. I think there's going to be a lot of sort of employment rights questions that are coming up. And I mean, ultimately, it's going to be about accommodating everyone. And on the positive side, we've come a long way in doing that already. Like some of those accommodations that people would have to take that they didn't used to think were possible, like letting people work from home and distancing people, that's already been proven that it can be done. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. If there's, let me see. How do you see technology advancements becoming more of a force multiplier for travel risk management, or perhaps displacing some of the human-powered efforts? Anyone have anything?
I can.
Go for it, Paul.
Obviously, we're going to rely on technology a lot for the scalability of solutions. A lot of the things that we do for a small organization versus a large one, a lot of things are possible when you're small. I mean, it's much like being a small country. So, for example, we've all seen in the news how wonderfully Israel is doing with its vaccine rollout. Part of the advantage, not the only advantage, but part of their advantage is the very small geographical size of the country, and the high-tech nature of their society. But managing this, a lot of the things around travel policy within a very small organization is easy to do manually. It can be done manually. It's a little bit of tedium, but as an organization gets bigger and bigger, or if we just translate that to a very large company, it becomes very difficult if we need technological solutions. So we can automate a lot of things, right? We can automate provision of information to people who are about to travel, who have booked a trip. We can automate provision of travel advice. We can automate managerial visibility on the steps taken for risk mitigation during travel. We can automate welfare checks to people who are out traveling. We can automate communications and provision of information during travel. We can automate surveys to be taken, as you mentioned earlier, in the post-travel arena. So I think a lot of the aspects of communications and information provision, as well as booking and the like, can all be automated to allow for scalability.
Yes, okay. Thank you. So I think with that, we are almost at 3:00. Thank you all so much for being on this panel. I'm going to turn it over to Nancy for some closing words.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think excellent insight and advice from each one of you. It certainly shows the importance of a travel risk management policy, whether you're a small company, medium size, or a large company. There's options available to you to be able to help put together the essential tools, knowledge, and resources that you need to keep your travelers and your companies protected in this very, very risky world that we're living in. So thank you all so much to our speakers today. Kate and Suzanne are actually our chair and vice chair of our risk committee. So thank you so much for taking the time to coordinate this very first of our risk committee and the Gbta Canada committee webinars. Brooke sits on our Gbta Canada advisory board. So a special thank you to Brooke for her insight and expertise in contributing the buyer perspective, and to Paul for being a panelist with some great insight to share and best practices. I have to say it was interesting, Brooke, you mentioned work-life integration, not balance. I think that is absolutely a key. Everything blends together in this new world we're in. And that certainly, breeds a lot of opportunity, but also areas for improvement. So thank you all for sharing everything that you've done today. And with that, I would like to mention that we do have more sessions coming up. So our Gbta Canada Technology Committee webinar will be on April 22nd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So we look forward to welcoming everyone to our webinar then. And we will keep you posted with all of the opportunities for virtual and some live in-person opportunities within 2021 that will be coming up with Gbta Canada. Thank you to our panelists, to our speakers, and thank you for joining today. Take care.